The scream tore through the hospital corridor just as the doors burst open. "Push! One more time! Madam, push!" Alexander Blackwood stood frozen outside the delivery room, his expensive suit stained with blood he didn't remember touching. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Machines beeped wildly on the other side of the glass. Doctors shouted orders. Nurses rushed back and forth. Then, suddenly, silence. The kind that didn't feel normal. The door opened. A doctor stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Blackwood?" Alexander stepped forward immediately. "Where's my son?" The doctor hesitated. That hesitation was the first crack. "The baby is alive, but there were complications." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What kind of complications?" The doctor inhaled. "Your son was born deaf." The words hit him harder than a slap. "What?" Alexander laughed sharply. "No, that's not possible. Fix it." The doctor shook his head slowly. "We've run the tests. It's congenital, permanent." Alexander felt something hot rise in his chest. "You're telling me the heir to my empire can't hear?" "I'm telling you your son cannot hear sound." A scream echoed from inside the room. Then, flatlining alarms. Another doctor rushed out. "We're losing her!" Alexander pushed forward. "What's happening to my wife?" No one answered him. Minutes later, a nurse came out with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. We did everything we could." Alexander staggered back. His wife was gone. His son lived, but in silence. That night, the wealthiest man in the country lost the only woman he ever loved and gained a child he didn't know how to face. Years passed, but the silence stayed. 7 years later, the Blackwood mansion stood tall, loud with generators, fountains, and endless activity. Guards marched the compound, staff moved quickly, cars came and went. Inside the mansion, a small boy sat alone on the floor, pressing his palm against the glass wall as fireworks exploded outside. The world was celebrating something. He felt nothing. Lucas Blackwood was 7 years old. He had the best toys, the biggest rooms, and everything money could buy, except sound. A tutor waved frantically in front of him. Lucas didn't look up. "Lucas!" the tutor shouted, forgetting for a moment that shouting meant nothing. Lucas stared at the floor. The tutor sighed and stood. "I'm sorry, sir," she told Alexander later. "She won't engage." Alexander didn't even look at her. "Then you're useless." She was fired before she reached the gate. Doctors came, therapists came, specialists from different countries flew in. None stayed long. Some blamed the condition, some blamed the child, some blamed lack of progress. Alexander blamed everyone. At dinner one night, his business partner tried to speak kindly. "He's still your son, Alex." Alexander slammed his fork down. "My son was supposed to carry my name forward, not sit there staring like a ghost." Lucas flinched at the vibration. Alexander noticed and looked away. He refused to learn sign language. He should be cured, Alexander told his staff, not accommodated. The boy grew quieter. One afternoon, Lucas stood in the hallway while servants rushed past him without noticing. A vase slipped from someone's hands and shattered loudly on the floor. Everyone jumped. Lucas didn't react. A maid stopped. She looked at the boy, really looked. Her name was Mara. She had just been hired that morning. No one paid attention to her. She wore simple clothes and kept her head low. But she crouched slowly in front of Lucas and gently tapped the floor twice. Lucas looked up, startled. She smiled softly and tapped her chest, then pointed to him. He frowned. She picked up a broken shard, placed it on the floor, and gently knocked it. Lucas felt the vibration through the marble. His eyes widened. Mara tapped the floor again, then his chest. Lucas hesitated, then placed his palm down. He felt it. A tiny smile appeared. From that moment, Lucas followed her. Mara didn't speak much. She used gestures, small signs, patient pauses. Lucas responded. At night, he slept better. At breakfast, he ate. Alexander noticed the changes. "Why is he smiling?" he asked one morning. The head maid hesitated. "There's a new maid, sir. She spends time with him." Alexander frowned. "Remove her." "She hasn't done anything wrong. I said remove her." But before that could happen, something happened that changed everything. Late one night, Lucas couldn't sleep. Mara found him sitting on the floor, rocking slightly. She knelt and gently placed a small wrapped object in his hands. Lucas froze. He looked at her. She nodded. He held it. Then his breath caught. His body stiffened. Tears filled his eyes. Security cameras captured everything. And somewhere else in the mansion, Alexander Blackwood stared at the monitor, his heart pounding. "What did you give my son?" he demanded as he stormed toward the room. And for the first time in 7 years, the silence was about to be challenged. Alexander burst into the room so hard the door slammed against the wall. Mara turned sharply, instinctively pulling Lucas behind her. Lucas felt the vibration of the door and shrank, clutching the small object tightly in his fist. "What did you give him?" Alexander demanded, his voice sharp, furious, afraid. "Who gave you permission to touch my son?" Mara stood slowly. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes stayed calm. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she gently took Lucas's hands and guided them to Alexander's chest. Alexander recoiled. "Get your hands off me!" Lucas flinched at the sudden movement. Mara stepped back quickly and bowed her head. She raised her palms in surrender, then pointed to Lucas, then to Alexander's throat. She placed her own hand on her chest and hummed softly, feeling the vibration. Alexander froze. "What are you doing?" he snapped. Mara carefully reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the object again. It was small, crude-looking, made of metal and rubber, with a thin strap attached. "It's not a toy," she said quietly, "and it's not dangerous." Alexander stared at it. "Then explain why my son is crying." Mara swallowed. Because for the first time in his life, he felt sound. Alexander laughed bitterly. "That's impossible." She looked at Lucas. "Show him." Lucas hesitated. His fingers trembled. Then slowly, he stepped forward and placed his palm against Alexander's chest. "Say something," Mara said quietly. Alexander scoffed, but spoke anyway, and then he felt it. Not sound, vibration. A faint hum beneath his own skin, traveling through his chest into the child's hand. His breath caught. "What is this?" he whispered. Mara spoke carefully. "Your son doesn't hear sound the way you do. His ears don't process it, but his body does. Bones carry vibration, rhythm, pressure." Alexander stared at his son's hand, and for the first time, he understood. "What is this?" he whispered, despite himself. Mara spoke carefully. "Your son isn't completely without perception. His ears don't process sound, but his bones do. Vibrations, rhythm, pressure." Alexander shook his head. "Doctors said—" "They didn't test for this," she said, her voice firmer now. "They assumed. They always assume." Alexander's eyes darkened. "You're telling me every specialist I hired was wrong, and a maid figured this out?" Mara met his gaze. "I studied medical engineering before I became a maid."
If you're still watching right now, this message is for you. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. And your situation is not the end of your story. What happens next in this story proves that help can arrive quietly and change everything. Silence stretched between them. Alexander laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect you to believe me," she said. "I expect you to watch your son." Lucas was crying quietly now, not in fear, but in overwhelm. Mara knelt and placed the device gently against his collarbone. She tapped the floor softly. Lucas gasped. His hands pressed harder. His face lit up. Alexander's chest tightened painfully. "How long?" he asked hoarsely. "How long have you known this?" Mara hesitated. "Longer than I've known your son." Alexander's eyes sharpened. "Explain." She exhaled slowly. "Years ago, I worked as a research assistant at a private hospital. We discovered cases like his. Children misdiagnosed because full tests were too expensive or unnecessary." Alexander's jaw clenched. "When I pushed to continue the research," Mara continued, "I was silenced, fired, threatened. My work was buried." Alexander stepped back as if struck. "You're saying my son was never given a full chance," she finished softly. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. Guards rushed in. "Sir," one said, "do you want us to remove her?" Alexander raised his hand slowly, never taking his eyes off Lucas. "No," he said, "everyone out." The guards hesitated, then left. Alexander turned back to Mara. "If you're lying—" "I know," she said. "You'll destroy me." He looked at his son again, really looked. Lucas stood there clutching the device like it was life itself. Alexander felt something crack inside him. "Show me," he said quietly. "Show me everything." That night, they didn't sleep. Mara demonstrated vibrations with music, footsteps, tapping, heartbeats. Lucas reacted every time. Alexander watched, silent. By morning, his hands were trembling. "How much will this cost to fix?" he asked finally. Mara looked at him. "It's not about fixing, it's about understanding." Alexander scoffed. "Understanding doesn't change reality." She looked straight at him. Neither does denial. Something in her tone made him pause. Days passed. Lucas changed rapidly. He laughed more. He reached for people. He slept peacefully. Alexander began staying home. He tried speaking while Lucas touched his throat. At first it felt ridiculous. Then it felt intimate. Then it felt necessary. But not everyone was happy. The head doctor noticed the changes. "This device is unapproved," the doctor told him sharply. "You're risking false hope."
Alexander stared at him. "You said there was no hope." The doctor shifted. "Medically." "You never tested for this," Alexander interrupted. The doctor stiffened. "It wasn't standard procedure." "Because?" Alexander pressed. The doctor didn't answer. That night, Alexander reviewed old reports. Something didn't add up. He called Mara to his office. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. She lowered her eyes. "Because men like you don't listen to women like me." The words stung. "Stay," he said after a long pause. "Work with him, officially." She nodded.
but shadows were already moving. The doctor made calls. Files disappeared. Threats resurfaced. One evening, Mara was stopped at the gate. "Your services are no longer needed," a guard told her. Lucas screamed silently as she was escorted away. Alexander arrived too late. His son was on the floor, shaking, pounding his fists against the marble. Alexander knelt, helpless. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. And somewhere in the city, Mara knew this fight was far from over. Alexander arrived at the gate just as the car disappeared into traffic. He stood there, staring at the empty road, his chest rising and falling too fast. Inside the house, Lucas's silent cries echoed through the marble halls, not in sound, but in vibration, in the way the floor trembled beneath Alexander's shoes. "Where is she?" Alexander demanded, spinning toward the guards. One of them swallowed. "Orders came from the medical board, sir. They said she was a liability." Alexander's eyes went cold. "Who signed it?" The guard hesitated. "Dr. Hargreaves." Alexander said nothing. He turned and walked back inside. Lucas was curled on the floor of his room, clutching the device to his chest, rocking back and forth. His face was wet with tears, his mouth open in a silent scream. Alexander knelt beside him. "It's okay," he said automatically, then stopped. The words meant nothing. Lucas didn't look at him. Alexander placed his hand on the floor and tapped twice, the way Mara did. Lucas froze. Alexander tapped again, then placed his hand on his own chest and spoke softly. "It's me." Lucas looked up slowly. Alexander guided Lucas's hand to his throat. He spoke again. "I'm here." Lucas's fingers trembled, then tightened. For a moment it worked. Then he shook his head violently and pulled away, pointing toward the door, his face contorted with grief. "She's gone," Alexander whispered, realization crushing him. "And I let it happen." That night, Alexander didn't sleep. He sat in his study, surrounded by screens, replaying old footage, rereading medical files, digging deeper than he ever had before.
At dawn, he found it. A suppressed report. A note marked non-essential. A recommendation to test bone conduction response, rejected. Signed by Dr. Hargreaves. Alexander's hand clenched into a fist. He summoned the doctor immediately. Dr. Hargreaves arrived confident, calm, smug. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Alexander slid the file across the desk. "Explain this." The doctor glanced at it, then shrugged. "Experimental, unnecessary. You buried it." "I protected your interests," the doctor said smoothly. "Hope is dangerous, especially false hope." Alexander stood slowly. "You lied to me. I made a judgment call. You stole 7 years from my son." The doctor's expression hardened. "If you push this, you'll expose more than you intend. Hospitals, boards, investors." Alexander smiled thinly. "Good." The doctor laughed nervously. "You won't burn down your own empire." Alexander leaned forward. "Watch me." Within hours, lawyers moved. Contracts were frozen, accounts audited. Dr. Hargreaves tried to leave the country. He didn't make it past the airport. But Alexander had another problem. Lucas wouldn't eat. He wouldn't engage. He clutched the device constantly, like a lifeline, and pushed everyone else away. Alexander tried. He really did. He learned basic signs. He copied Mara's gestures. He tapped, hummed, spoke gently. But Lucas kept looking toward the door. 3 days later, Alexander found a note slipped under his office door, a single line: "If you truly want to help him, stop fighting the truth." No signature. Alexander stared at it for a long time. Then he grabbed his coat. He found Mara in a small rented room on the edge of the city, packing her few belongings. She froze when she saw him. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I fired the doctor," Alexander replied. She laughed bitterly. "There are dozens like him." "I know. I'm dealing with them." She shook her head. "You can't win." "I already lost. I'm just done pretending otherwise." She studied his face, searching for arrogance, for pride. She didn't find it. "Alexander needs you, but he needs you more." Her jaw tightened. "They'll come after me again. Then they'll come after me too." Silence. Finally, she nodded once. "I'll help the boy, not you." Alexander accepted it without argument. When Mara returned to the mansion, Lucas ran to her the moment he saw her, throwing himself into her arms, sobbing silently. Mara held him tightly, her own tears falling. Alexander watched from a distance, guilt heavy in his chest. Healing resumed, but this time it was harder. Lucas was afraid of losing her again. Mara insisted on transparency, every test, every step. Alexander agreed. They worked together, carefully, deliberately. Lucas began responding more consistently. He learned rhythms, patterns, emotional cues. Alexander learned patience. One evening, Lucas placed the device aside and pressed his hand to Alexander's chest without prompting. Alexander spoke. "I'm sorry." Lucas frowned, concentrating. Alexander spoke again. "I failed you." Lucas didn't understand the words, but he felt the truth. The first sign Lucas learned to give Alexander was simple: stay.
But trouble returned quickly. A media leak surfaced. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire experiments on deaf child." Protesters gathered outside the gate. Investors panicked. Alexander's phone rang non-stop. "End this," his board demanded. "Fire her." Alexander stood in the chaos, watching Lucas cling to Mara. He remembered the hospital corridor, the silence, the loss. He turned back to the board and said, "No." He went live that night. He spoke publicly for the first time, not as a tycoon, but as a father. "My son was failed," he said, "by doctors, by systems, by me. This ends now." He shared the reports, the buried data, the truth. The world reacted. Some praised him, some attacked him. He didn't care. Lucas watched the vibrations of his father's voice through the screen, his small hand resting on Mara's arm. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like anticipation. The backlash was immediate. By morning, the gates of the Blackwood mansion were surrounded by reporters, protesters, and cameras. Lucas felt the constant vibration beneath his feet and clung to Mara's hand, his eyes wide. Alexander stood between them in the chaos. "They won't touch you," he told Mara quietly. She didn't answer. She was watching Lucas. Inside the house, lawyers argued, executives shouted, and phones rang without pause. "You're destroying everything you built, all for a theory and a maid." Alexander calmly replied, "I built it to protect my family. If it can't do that, it deserves to fall." Lucas tugged at Alexander's sleeve. Alexander knelt. "I'm here." Lucas placed his hand on Alexander's throat, then on his own chest, mimicking what he'd learned. His fingers trembled as he tried to sign something new. Mara's breath caught. "He's asking a question." Alexander swallowed. "What is it, son?" Lucas struggled, then signed, slowly, clumsily. "Safe?" Alexander nodded, tears burning his eyes. "Yes, you're safe."
The protests lasted days, so did the investigations. Hospitals were audited, doctors were suspended, research files resurfaced. Other families came forward with stories painfully similar to Lucas's. Mara worked tirelessly, barely sleeping, refining the device, adjusting it to Lucas's responses. It wasn't magic. Progress came in small steps. Some days Lucas reacted strongly. Other days he shut down completely.
One night, after a particularly difficult session, Lucas pushed the device away and curled into himself. Mara reached for him, but he pulled back. Alexander watched, helpless. "He's overwhelmed," Mara said softly. "He's afraid the feeling will disappear." Alexander sat on the floor instead of his chair. "Then we slow down." Mara looked at him, surprised. "I spent 7 years trying to force solutions. I won't force him anymore." Lucas glanced at him. Alexander tapped the floor gently, twice. Lucas hesitated, then tapped back. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Weeks passed. The noise outside faded. Support grew louder than criticism. Funding poured into open research. Other children began testing similar methods. One afternoon, Mara stood in Alexander's office, holding a folder. "I've been offered a position," she said quietly. "A global institute. They want me to lead the program." Alexander nodded. "You should take it." Her eyes flicked toward the door where Lucas was playing. "It would mean traveling." Alexander understood immediately. His chest tightened. "How long?" "Months at a time." Silence stretched between them. "I won't stop you," he said finally. "But Lucas—" "I know. That's why I haven't answered them yet." That evening, Mara sat with Lucas on the floor. She guided his hands, slowly, carefully. "Go?" Lucas signed uncertainly. Mara smiled sadly. "Sometimes." Lucas's face crumpled. He shook his head hard. Alexander stepped forward. "Mara won't disappear," he said, placing Lucas's hand on his chest. "I'll make sure of that." Lucas studied him. Then he signed something that Mara gasped. "Together." Alexander closed his eyes. The decision was made. Months later, Lucas stood in a quiet auditorium, holding the improved device against his collarbone. The room wasn't silent, but to him it was filled with feeling. Alexander stood beside him. Mara watched from the front row. Alexander leaned down and spoke softly. "Can you feel this?" Lucas nodded. Alexander tapped twice on the podium. Lucas smiled. Then slowly, carefully, Lucas signed something new. "I hear you." The room erupted. Alexander broke. He pulled his son into his arms, holding him tightly, not caring who saw. Later that night, back at the mansion, Lucas lay in bed, calm, peaceful. Alexander sat beside him. Lucas reached out, placing his hand on Alexander's chest one last time. Alexander spoke, voice barely steady. "I love you." Lucas didn't hear the words, but he felt them, and that was enough. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what moment touched you the most. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life.